How did medieval people bury the dead? And what went wrong? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, colder world. A world of stone churches, candlelight, and the soft, uneven rhythm of shovels in frozen earth. We're talking about death tonight. Specifically, what medieval people did with it. So, settle in, dim the lights, find your comfiest blanket, and let's wander, slowly, gently, through graveyards that haven't seen flowers in centuries. We'll talk about how medieval people buried their dead, how they honored them, how they feared them, and, of course, how they occasionally got it all spectacularly wrong. Death in the Middle Ages wasn't an interruption. It was a neighbor. It lived next door, showed up at dinner, and politely reminded everyone that they, too, would soon be on the guest list. It wasn't morbid, just practical. After all, if the average lifespan barely nudged past 40, you didn't have time to pretend otherwise. Medieval people didn't whisper about death. They sang about it, carved it, wore it. The dance of death, danse macabre, wound its way across murals, manuscripts, and even the edges of church pews. It wasn't meant to be frightening. It was meant to be fair. Because in death, everyone danced, kings, peasants, monks, and thieves, all holding hands in a great equalizing jig toward eternity. When someone died, which statistically happened a lot, the process began almost immediately. Bodies decomposed quickly, especially in summer. So, families moved fast. If you were poor, your loved ones washed the body themselves. They used simple cloths, perhaps dipped in vinegar or wine, to cleanse the skin. Then they wrapped the corpse in linen, or, more often, the best sheet they could spare. If you were wealthy, servants did it for you. They added herbs, rosemary, sage, maybe lavender if you could afford it. Not for sentiment, but for the smell. A noble corpse could take a few days to reach its final resting place, and the olfactory situation could deteriorate quickly. Now, let's drift quietly into the churchyard. Medieval graveyards were rarely solemn gardens. They were busy, uneven, and perpetually in use. Tombs were crammed together, and plots were reused constantly. Space was valuable, even in death. After a few decades, when a grave's occupant had, let's say, sufficiently mingled with the soil, the bones were dug up, stacked neatly, and placed in an ossuary, a bone house. Some were simple sheds, others were works of art. Walls of skulls arranged in patterns, femurs forming delicate crosses. It sounds macabre to us, but to them it was a kind of recycling, a way of making room for the next generation of the faithful departed. And of course, the closer you were buried to the church, the better your spiritual real estate. The holiest ground was nearest the altar. So, if you were rich, powerful, or had recently donated a suspiciously large amount to the local abbey, you could expect a prime plot near the front steps. Peasants and the poor, meanwhile, found themselves toward the outer edges, by the walls, under trees, sometimes half forgotten. Still, Consecrated ground was consecrated ground. No one complained. Inside churches, things were more complicated and smellier. Important people were often buried inside the church itself, under stone slabs or ornamental tombs. You can imagine what centuries of indoor burials did to the air quality. It was said that in summer, the scent of holiness was somewhat overwhelming. Monks, saints, and nobles were the main occupants of these indoor graveyards. Their tombs became tourist attractions for the devout, who came to pray, weep, and occasionally chip off tiny pieces of relics when the priest wasn't looking. But of course, not everyone was allowed such a dignified end. Let's drift to the darker side, the graves outside the walls. There lay the excommunicated, the unbaptized, the executed, and the suicides. They were buried at crossroads, where their souls would supposedly lose their way, unable to find their way home or into heaven. Sometimes a stake was driven through the corpse, just to make sure it stayed where it was put. Animals that had attacked people were also sometimes buried in these dishonored plots, a reminder that medieval justice was, if nothing else, thorough. And if you happened to die during a plague, well, the best you could hope for was a communal trench, hastily blessed and covered in lime. There were too many bodies, too few priests, and no time for ceremony. It was efficient. If nothing else, medieval people were deeply practical about death, but they were also a little superstitious. They believed that bodies could, under certain conditions, return, not quite as flesh-eating monsters, but as restless spirits, souls trapped between worlds because their burials had been done incorrectly. There are accounts of revenants, corpses that supposedly rose from their graves, shuffling back to the villages they'd left behind. Most of these tales were rooted in poor decomposition and colder weather, bodies appearing disturbingly well preserved when exhumed years later. Naturally, this was interpreted as supernatural activity, rather than, say, the miracle of anaerobic soil conditions. The solution was simple: decapitation, dismemberment, or a nice dose of fire. Just to be sure. Let's drift back toward the gentler side, to funerals. A medieval funeral was as much about the living as the dead. The goal was to help the soul find its way to heaven, and to make sure everyone else saw how well loved, or at least well connected, the deceased had been. If you were wealthy, your funeral was an event. Dozens of candles, processions of priests chanting psalms, and mourners paid to cry on cue. Black mourning clothes weren't yet common. People wore their best, often white or gray. At the end of the service, a requiem mass was sung, and bells tolled to announce your passage to the afterlife. The number of tolls sometimes reflected your social rank, a rather audible reminder of inequality, even in death. If you were poor, the process was humbler: a single priest, a few neighbors, and maybe one candle if someone could spare it. But the prayers were the same. In theory, at least, God didn't care about your candle budget, and yet things often went wrong. Bodies decayed faster than expected. Graves collapsed after rain. Sometimes animals, wolves, dogs, or rats found their way into shallow pits. In crowded cities, gravediggers worked so quickly that mistakes happened. There are records from Paris in the 14th century describing corpses stacked like firewood, waiting for burial during the Black Death. Mass graves overflowed. Lime was poured liberally, but it only did so much. One particularly grim chronicler complained that the smell of death hung so thickly over the city that even the air became ill. He wasn't wrong. It likely did. Occasionally, even nobles suffered indignities. When King William the Conqueror died in 1087, his body was so badly swollen that it burst during his funeral, right in the middle of the church. The stench was so unbearable that priests hurried through the ceremony and fled. It's one of history's least glamorous farewells. Embalming, when attempted, was hit or miss. They used wine, salt, and herbs to slow decay, and sometimes honey, which worked surprisingly well. Alexander the Great's body was reportedly preserved in honey for transport, though medieval imitators rarely achieved similar success. When embalming failed, things got creative. Some nobles were boiled down, quite literally, so that their bones could be transported home without the unpleasant side effects of rotting flesh. The process was called mos teutonicus, or the German method. Because of course it was, medieval burial wasn't just about the body, though it was about eternity. The Church preached that your body was only sleeping, waiting for resurrection. So, people took care to bury corpses facing east, toward the rising sun, and symbolically toward the return of Christ. Graves were marked with simple wooden crosses or carved stones. Epitaphs were rare for commoners, but the wealthy indulged in long, flowery inscriptions, the medieval equivalent of a five-star review. Tombs often featured effigies, stone likenesses of the deceased, carved with eyes closed and hands folded in prayer. Sometimes their dogs or lions were sculpted at their feet, symbols of loyalty or courage. The irony, of course, was that these serene figures often looked nothing like their living counterparts. Some looked suspiciously youthful for people who died of gout at 60. Over time, death became a business. Monks and priests offered chantries, perpetual prayers for souls, funded by generous donations. The idea was that the more prayers said for you, the shorter your stay in purgatory. This led to a flourishing market in spiritual real estate. Wealthy families founded entire chapels just to keep their souls on the church's subscription plan. Centuries later, reformers would call this corruption. At the time, it was simply good accounting. Even with all the ritual and reverence, the medieval relationship with death was oddly practical. They saw it every day, in the fields, on the roads, in the cradle. They didn't romanticize it. They accommodated it. The plague didn't teach them despair. It taught them efficiency. The church didn't comfort them with denial. It gave them structure, a script to follow in the face of chaos, and perhaps that's what makes their world feel so distant. They didn't fear death's presence, they feared its absence. The idea of dying unblessed, unburied, unremembered. So, what went wrong with medieval burials? Almost everything. Bodies bloated, graves flooded, tombs cracked, relics were stolen, and half the saints turned out to be mislabeled. Bones, saints, and the business of the afterlife. Hey, everyone, if you're still awake, or even half awake, welcome back. We're still drifting among the graves tonight, still wandering softly through the dim light of candles and the faint sound of bells. But this time, we're leaving the graveyard itself and going underground, because medieval Europe didn't stop at burying the dead. It reused them. Yes, bones had a second career. Some became holy relics. Some decorated church walls. Some were politely rearranged into geometric piles that would make any modern minimalist proud. The medieval world didn't just live with death. It built with it. So let's follow them down into the crypts and bone houses, where eternity was surprisingly well organized. Let's start with the ossuary. By the 12th century, graveyards were running out of space, and fast. When everyone wants to be buried in consecrated ground, and nobody wants to leave, you get a real estate crisis of the eternal kind. The solution: move the older residents. After a few decades, the graves were quietly reopened. The bones were collected, washed, and placed into charnel houses, or ossuaries, usually right beside the church. If you're picturing a chaotic heap, you're only half right. The bones were often arranged deliberately. Skulls stacked neatly in rows. Femurs used to build decorative arches, sometimes even patterns. Death, but tidy. These were not horror shows. They were sacred spaces. Families could visit and pray, surrounded by the quiet proof that all flesh fades. But the faithful endure. One of the most famous ossuaries, though later in date, is in Sedlec, in modern-day Czechia. There, an enterprising monk in the 15th century decided to make the best of an overstocked bone supply. He arranged tens of thousands of skeletons into chandeliers, coats of arms, and columns. It sounds macabre, but it wasn't meant to frighten. It was meant to humble. A visual sermon in calcium. The chandelier alone supposedly contains every bone in the human body, several times over. Because why waste good material? But long before ossuaries, the medieval imagination had already elevated bones. Quite literally. Let's drift into the world of relics. Relics were the spiritual economy of the Middle Ages. Few par few. You could get your hands on a saint's body part. Your church instantly became a destination and a source of income. Pilgrims came from miles away to touch, see or pray near relics. They donated coins, bought candles, paid for blessings, And if you happen to own, say, the skull of a martyr or a vial of the Virgin Mary's milk, you were set for centuries. Of course, demand exceeded supply, which meant some creative sourcing. The early church had an awkward problem. There were more churches than saints. So bones were traded, duplicated, mislabeled, or forged outright. By the 13th century, Europe had enough fragments of the true cross to build a small fleet of ships. There were multiple heads of John the Baptist, and at least 3 right hands of Saint Stephen. No one seemed especially concerned by this. Faith, after all, thrives on abundance, and besides, who was going to argue with a bishop holding a gilded skull? Relics were often displayed in ornate reliquaries, boxes or shrines made of gold, enamel, and gems. The bones themselves might be wrapped in silk, labeled on vellum, and sealed with wax. Sometimes they were sculpted into full figures, with the skull encased in silver, so that only the face showed through. Others were fashioned into reliquary arms or legs, silver limbs holding blessings like strange, holy prosthetics. If that sounds eerie, imagine a procession of monks carrying one of those through a foggy medieval street, chanting softly, candles flickering against the metal hand of Saint whoever it was. It's both haunting and serene, which is exactly how they liked it. Now, relics weren't just for show, they worked. At least, that's what everyone believed. Relics could heal, protect, and intercede. If a drought lingered, the bones of a saint were paraded through the fields to encourage rain. If a city faced plague or invasion, the relics were carried around the walls, a sort of divine security system. And if you were sick, you might crawl, literally crawl, to a shrine, sleep beside it overnight, and hope for a miracle. Sometimes, the miracles even happened, or seemed to. Faith is powerful, and so is placebo. But not everyone appreciated the bone-based boom. Some clerics worried that relic mania was getting out of hand. There were scams, merchants, selling bones of ordinary criminals, claiming they were apostles. There were thefts, holy robberies, where relics were rescued from rival monasteries under cover of darkness. One famous theft involved the bones of Saint Nicholas. Yes, the same Nicholas who eventually became Santa Claus. His remains were taken from his tomb in Myra by sailors from Bari, Italy. In 1087, they claimed divine permission. Myra called it grave robbing, but Bari got the relics and the tourists, so everyone else's opinion didn't matter. To this day, St. Nicholas lies in Bari, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, holiness and business were rarely far apart. Let's drift back now to the ordinary dead, the unsainted, the unremarkable, the forgotten. Most medieval people had no relics, no tomb effigies, no gilded shrines, just earth and maybe, if they were lucky, a small wooden marker that would rot away by the next generation. But even they weren't entirely left alone. In some villages, the local church kept mortuary rolls, lists of the dead, carried from monastery to monastery by messengers. Each community along the way would stop, pray, and add their own blessings to the parchment before passing it on. The rolls could stretch for dozens of feet, filled with names that otherwise might have vanished completely. It was a kind of medieval internet, slow, solemn, and powered by monks instead of modems. Now, let's talk about something that almost never went right: embalming. The church discouraged embalming for ordinary folk, but nobles and kings, well, they liked to travel. Even after death, bodies were opened, the organs removed and buried separately, the cavities filled with herbs and spices. If you were important enough, your heart might be sent to one monastery and your bones to another, just to spread the blessings around. Richard the Lionheart, for example, managed to die in France, have his heart buried in Normandy, and the rest of him in Anjou. A man of many parts. This practice was called dilaceratio corporis, the division of the body. It wasn't considered gruesome, it was logistics. Because sometimes eternity required a bit of planning. Even when they tried their best, embalming could go wrong. During the funeral of Philip the Fair of France, his heart, sealed in a gold case, was carried through the streets. Unfortunately, the heat caused the wax around it to melt, producing a smell so powerful that mourners fainted in droves. On another occasion, the embalmed body of a noblewoman leaked from its coffin during transport, prompting her entourage to bury her by the roadside and send word back that she had arrived safely. It was, by all accounts, untrue. Of course, not every body decomposed on schedule. When certain saints or holy figures were exhumed years later and found to be intact, it was declared a miracle. These incorruptible bodies became objects of deep veneration. They were placed in glass cases or seated on thrones, dressed in embroidered robes, their skin darkened, their features stiffened. But to the faithful, this was proof of divine favor. The irony, of course, is that natural mummification was often caused by dry soil or good ventilation, not heaven's special intervention. But in an age that loved symbols more than science, it hardly mattered. Let's drift back toward the surface for a moment. Back to the living world above the bones. Every village had its rituals for remembering the dead. The most famous was All Souls' Day, on November 2nd. It was a day for prayer, bells and food offerings, bread for the poor, candles for the graves, and sometimes small cakes baked in the shape of bones. In some places, children went door to door collecting these treats in exchange for prayers. And so ancient ancestor of Halloween, the medieval world wasn't trying to ward off ghosts that night. They were feeding them, keeping them close, because for them, the dead weren't gone. They were just quieter. Death was never final in the Middle Ages. Souls lingered, prayers mattered, and the line between the living and the dead was more a soft blur than a solid wall. When a monk copied a manuscript, he might dedicate it to a deceased friend, believing that the act of writing itself would help redeem their soul. When a widow donated a lamp to the church, it wasn't charity. It was illumination, literally lighting her husband's path through purgatory. Everything was a transaction with eternity. Every candle, every Mass, every whispered Ave Maria was a kind of currency, and perhaps, in their own quiet way, they understood something we've forgotten, that remembrance is its own kind of resurrection. Let's pause for a moment and imagine one of those candlelit nights, a small stone chapel on the edge of a village. The priest chanting softly, families kneeling, holding candles that flicker as the wind creeps under the door. Outside, the churchyard glimmers faintly, hundreds of small flames dancing over the graves, each one a promise, each one a memory, and beneath it all, the bones. Silent, patient, waiting. It's strangely comforting, isn't it? The medieval relationship with death wasn't one of fear. It was routine. The end of a season, not the end of meaning. They didn't hide from the dead. They lived among them. And, honestly, who could argue? Historians now think the eclipse's timing was pure coincidence, but it's comforting to know that cosmic phenomena have occasionally achieved what diplomacy could not. Still, even in Greece, superstition lingered. When the philosopher Anaxagoras suggested that eclipses were caused by the moon blocking the sun, not by divine wrath, he was charged with impiety, because in ancient Athens, saying maybe it's just physics was roughly equivalent to denying Zeus's personal interest in the weather. He narrowly escaped death, but his student, Pericles, went on to rule Athens during its golden age, so perhaps a little celestial heresy went a long way. By the time Rome inherited Greek learning, eclipses had become a kind of political shorthand. They were used as propaganda. When Julius Caesar was assassinated, a lunar eclipse followed soon after. The Romans took it as a sign, the heavens mourning the fallen dictator, or perhaps applauding his death. Depending on which side you were on, Augustus later commissioned poets to describe him as the man who restored light to the world after that. Darkness. It's a clever bit of branding, turning astronomy into PR. Nothing says divinely favored, like taking credit for daylight. Let's drift now into the medieval world, where religion had replaced mythology. But superstition had only gotten stronger. By then, people knew of eclipses. They could read about them in old books, but understanding them was another matter entirely. For most of medieval Europe, an eclipse was still something between a divine memo and a public scolding. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records an eclipse in the year 664 followed immediately by a great plague. Another in 1133 was said to foretell the death of King Henry I. Chroniclers wrote, with their usual understated horror, that the sun was darkened, and men feared greatly. It's almost charming how consistent the reaction was. Even the monks who copied these records centuries later would add little notes in the margins. The sun darkened again. The people wept. You can practically hear the sigh in their quill strokes. For medieval theologians, the logic was straightforward. The sun represented divine order. So, if it vanished, clearly someone had upset that order. Usually, someone meant everyone. Priests told people to confess their sins. Kings held processions of repentance, and peasants, those who couldn't afford either luxury, simply went indoors and waited for the apocalypse to be cancelled. There were also more personal fears. Pregnant women were warned to avoid sunlight during an eclipse, lest their babies be born deformed. Farmers were told not to harvest crops because the shadow had poisoned them, and animals were watched closely because they often behaved very sensibly, retreating to their dens or coops as the light faded. Humans, less sensibly, rang bells and prayed loudly, as if to remind God they were still here. 12th century. Monk in England described the sky turning as though the sun were iron. Chinese noted how the birds grew silent and the stars appeared in midday, and then added with mild exasperation, many fell to their knees in dread. He didn't mention what he did, probably because he was too busy watching. There's something quietly relatable about that. Even the educated couldn't resist staring straight at it, despite centuries of advice not to. In monasteries, eclipses were supposed to be moments of prayer and humility, but monks, being human and slightly bored, often treated them like science experiments. They charted the shadows on parchment, measured the fading light through holes in parchment screens, and noted the way animals responded. These were the first small steps toward understanding. Curiosity pushing through fear. Still, even scholars hedge their bets. If you're a medieval monk, you can study the heavens all you want, but you'll still whisper a prayer just in case it's the end of days. In the 1200s, Pope Gregory IX wrote that an eclipse represented the sorrow of the heavens for the sins of mankind. A lovely phrase, though he used it as justification for launching another crusade, which slightly diluted the poetic effect. Even royalty joined the panic. When an eclipse darkened Castile in 1501, Queen Isabella locked herself in her chapel and refused to eat until the light returned. In England, Henry VII's astrologers carefully spun eclipses into political omens, conveniently predicting disaster for his enemies. Never for him. It was a golden age of selective prophecy, and that was the strange balance of the medieval mind. Superstition, faith, and just enough scholarship to be dangerous. By the 14th century, some university scholars could predict eclipses with mathematical tables. Though their accuracy was often questionable, they might tell you an eclipse was coming around the middle of next Lent, which wasn't exactly calendar precision. But even that was progress. A flicker of logic in the darkness. Let's pause and picture it. A quiet English village. Maybe around 1250. The smith is hammering. Children are chasing chickens. And then, suddenly, the light begins to fail. When the sun disappeared, hey everyone, tonight. We're drifting back to a time when the sky was still mysterious. Before telescopes. Before science really got its act together. A time when the sun and moon weren't balls of rock and fire in space, but divine beings with moods, grudges, and a worrying habit of occasionally vanishing. So, go ahead and dim the lights, settle under your blanket, and let's talk about one of humanity's oldest fears, the day the daylight disappeared. An eclipse is, of course, nothing more than a celestial alignment, a neat little bit of geometry. The moon gets between the earth and the sun, and suddenly, everything goes dark. Simple, really, but for most of human history, it was anything but simple. You have to imagine living in a world where the sky was dependable. It rained when it was meant to. The sun rose every morning. And then, one day, it didn't. The light faded. The birds went quiet. The kee-coo. Air turned cold. And nobody knew why. That kind of thing tends to ruin your afternoon. The earliest record of a solar eclipse we have is from Mesopotamia. About 4,000 years ago, the scribes there wrote that the sun was put to shame, which is a poetic way of saying everyone panicked. The Babylonians were meticulous sky watchers. They saw the heavens as a divine message board, where the gods expressed approval or disapproval through weather, stars, and light. And when the sun darkened, it usually meant divine disapproval, specifically disapproval of the king, because naturally, if the world went wrong, it was the king's fault. That's the downside of being seen as the chosen of the gods. Every bad omen is a performance review. So when an eclipse loomed, Babylonian priests performed one of history's strangest acts of risk management. They would appoint a temporary king. This substitute was usually some unlucky prisoner or minor court official. He'd be dressed in royal robes, seated on the throne, and told that, congratulations, he was now the ruler of Babylon. Meanwhile, the real king quietly slipped away to the countryside, pretending to be a servant for a few days. When the eclipse passed, the substitute king was executed. The cosmic blame, they reasoned, would die with him. It's one of those moments in history where you can almost hear someone saying, "Look, it's not personal. The gods just need someone to smite." This kind of reasoning, that an eclipse was divine judgment aimed at the powerful, carried on for centuries. In Assyria, eclipses were treated as warnings to the empire itself. In Persia, they were bad omens for the Shah. And in Greece, even philosophers got nervous when the sky went dark. But if we drift east for a moment, the reaction in ancient China was rather more noisy. The Chinese believed a great celestial dragon tried to devour the sun during eclipses, which, to be fair, made as much sense as anything else before orbital mechanics. So, every time an eclipse began, entire cities erupted into clanging chaos. People banged pots and gongs, beat drums, and fired arrows into the sky, all to scare off the dragon. It worked every time. Of course, the sun always came back, which only confirmed that the noise was effective. Unfortunately, in 2136 BCE, two royal astronomers named Shi and Ho failed to predict an eclipse. The emperor was furious. They were executed for negligence. Their failure was recorded as drunkenness and dereliction of duty, which is possibly history's harshest performance warning for not tracking a giant. Imaginary dragon. In India, the cause of eclipses was a bit more personal. According to Hindu mythology, a demon named Rahu once disguised himself to drink the god's nectar of immortality. The sun and moon tattled. Vishnu decapitated him mid-sip. But Rahu's severed head remained immortal. And, naturally, bitter. Every so often, it tried to swallow the sun or moon in revenge. But, having no body, it couldn't hold them for long. Hence, the brief darkness of an eclipse. During those moments, people fasted, prayed, and stayed indoors. Pregnant women avoided cooking or looking at the sky, lest the child be marked by Rahu's shadow. Because if you're going to have a celestial demon decapitating light sources, you may as well build some practical safety guidelines around it. Back in Greece, eclipses slowly began to lose their mystique, at least among the philosophers. In 585 BCE, one famously interrupted a battle between the Lydians and the Medes. The sky darkened mid-fight. Both armies froze, dropped their weapons, and promptly declared peace. They decided the gods clearly wanted them to stop. Perfume, power, and the inevitable. goodbye. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a softer, stranger corner of royal history. The lights of the palace are low. Perfume lingers in the air. Rose water, amber, and just a hint of political anxiety. Servants whisper behind the curtains. And somewhere, down the endless hall of mirrors, a king is growing bored. Because tonight, we're talking about what happens after the affair. After the dances, the gifts, the diamonds, the declarations of eternal love that lasted, on average, about 6 months. We're talking about what happened to the royal mistresses once the king moved on. It's one of those quiet, unspoken chapters of history, not quite scandalous enough for legend, not quite respectable enough for textbooks, but it's where all the good stories are hiding. So, go ahead, get comfortable, pull up a blanket, maybe a cup of tea, because this won't be a tale of passion. It's a story of transitions, of fading perfume, soft exits, and the occasional mysterious retirement package. Let's begin in the 17th century, the golden age of royal mistresses. Because, naturally, the French started it. At the court of Louis XIV, being the king's mistress wasn't just a personal affair. It was practically a government position. Louis loved women almost as much as he loved himself. He had official mistresses, semi-official mistresses, and probably a few he forgot to categorize properly. But among them, one woman ruled supreme, Madame de Montespan. Bonne-Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart. She was clever, beautiful, and, most dangerously, funny. Wit, in the 17th century, was like dynamite in a corset. She could make the king laugh, which was rare and precious, because Louis mostly found other people tiresome. For years, she reigned beside him in everything but title. She bore him 7 children. She had her own apartments connected to his. Courtiers bowed to her. Even the queen had to tolerate her presence. And then, one day, Louis got bored. It wasn't sudden, exactly. Royal boredom was more like a slow, suffocating fog. You'd notice the gifts becoming smaller, the visits shorter, the smiles more perfunctory. By 1680, a newer, younger favorite had appeared, Madame de Maintenon. A quiet widow with none of Montespan's flamboyance, and all of her tact. Worse, rumors began to circulate that Montespan had dabbled in black magic to keep the king's affection, which, to be fair, was a fairly common hobby at the time. But it was still not ideal for one's reputation, and so, after more than a decade at the center of the French court, Madame de Montespan was dismissed. Gently, but firmly, she retired to a convent, as many mistresses did. Not because she was devout, but because it was the one place where her enemies couldn't gossip at her directly. She donated to the poor, attended Mass, and reportedly still enjoyed a good roast dinner when no one was looking. Louis never visited her again, but he paid her expenses for life, which in royal terms was almost romantic. That was the best-case scenario. The worst-case scenarios were, let's say, less poetic. Take Barbara Palmer, mistress to King Charles II of England, a man who, by his own admission, never saw a woman he didn't want to at least try to seduce. Barbara was magnificent, tall, sharp-tongued, and gloriously unbothered by convention. She began her affair with Charles before he even took the throne, and used it to carve out a position of immense influence. She had rooms in Whitehall Palace, a pension, and an official title, the Lady Castlemaine. Her enemies called her the uncrowned queen, though rarely to her face, because she was also known to throw things. Charles adored her, until he didn't. When Barbara lost her looks, or rather, when the court decided she had, Charles began to drift. He took new mistresses, younger, smoother, less likely to argue about politics. Barbara's reaction was spirited. She fought, shouted, and once allegedly tore down the royal bed curtains during an argument. Eventually, she was quietly replaced by another favorite, the French beauty Louise de Querouaille, who was everything Barbara wasn't: demure, polished, and safely unthreatening. Barbara retired to the countryside, still wealthy, but thoroughly bitter. She lived to an impressive old age, occasionally insulting people in the local church pews, and outlived nearly everyone who had once mocked her. A small a fragrant beginning. Hey, everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back into the Middle Ages, an era of mud, incense, and the faint aroma of despair. Go ahead and dim the lights. Settle into your blanket fort of modern hygiene. Maybe light a candle, though for full historical accuracy, it should ideally be made of animal fat and smell faintly like beef stew and church. Because tonight, we're exploring one of history's more pungent mysteries. What did medieval peasants actually smell like? It's one of those questions everyone secretly wonders, but few are brave enough to ask out loud. We've all seen the movies, the grimy faces, the dirt-caked hands, people apparently living in a world where soap was a myth and water was only good for drowning in. But the truth, as usual, is a little less dramatic and a little more absurd. Let's start with this. Medieval people did not think of clean and dirty the way we do. They didn't have mint-scented shampoo, but they did have an entire theory of cleanliness. A spiritual, social, and, occasionally, olfactory affair. You weren't just supposed to smell good, You were supposed to be in balance. Too much bathing could make you sick. Too little made you morally questionable. The trick was to hover somewhere between sweaty and saintly. Let's drift first to a peasant village around the year 1300. The air is full of smoke from wood fires, the tang of damp earth, and the background scent of animals that seem to live everywhere, including, in many cases, inside the house. A house, by the way, is being generous. Most peasants lived in one-room cottages made of wattle and daub, sticks, mud, and straw held together by hope and animal dung. Inside, a central hearth for cooking, a couple of straw beds, maybe a small wooden stool. If you're very lucky, a cat. If you're less lucky, several mice. But contrary to every movie ever made, peasants didn't just wallow in filth all day. They did bathe. Just not in the way we'd expect. Bathing, but make it medieval. Medieval people liked bathing. They just had a complicated relationship with it. Public bathhouses were common in towns and cities, places where people could soak, gossip, and pretend not to notice that the water hadn't been changed since last week. In London, for instance, there were dozens of stews, a word that originally meant bathhouse, though it very quickly began to mean something else, because naturally people turned them into a mix between a spa and a brothel. Still, they were popular. Even the poor would save up for the occasional scrub, hot water, herbs, and perhaps some rose petals if you wanted to feel fancy. Peasants in the countryside didn't have bathhouses, but they had rivers, streams, and tubs. Bathing wasn't daily. It was more of a seasonal event, like taxes or plague outbreaks. Spring and summer were the prime times to wash off the winter. Winter itself? Best not to risk pneumonia for the sake of cleanliness. When peasants did bathe, they often used homemade soap. Early soap was made from animal fat and wood ash, a smell that could best be described as barnyard adjacent. It got the job done, but you wouldn't exactly feel refreshed. And, for the most part, people weren't trying to scrub every inch of themselves. The medieval idea of hygiene was what historians call partial washing. You'd wash your face, your hands, maybe your feet. You'd rinse your hair with vinegar or lye. Everything else was left to fate. Wool clothing and divine forgiveness. Here too, clean clothes, cleaner conscience. But here's the twist. Even if people didn't wash themselves constantly, they did wash their clothes. Linen undergarments, called shifts or chemises, were a medieval person's secret weapon. They were the barrier between your body and your outer clothes, and they were washed relatively often. You might wear the same tunic for months, but that linen layer underneath, it soaked up sweat, oil, and odor, and could be laundered in cold water with lye soap. This meant that many medieval people, especially women, smelled more like linen and wood smoke than rot and decay. A bit musty, yes, but not catastrophic. It's worth remembering, too, that dirty was relative. Everyone smelled like smoke because the taste of hunger. What did medieval peasants actually eat during famines? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world before refrigeration, before canned food, before anything remotely resembling a grocery store. A world where one bad harvest could mean your entire village slowly starved. And you, your family, and your livestock might all end up competing for the same handful of moldy grain. So, get comfortable. Pull up the blankets. Settle into the quiet hum of your room. And let's drift gently back to the Middle Ages to explore what people actually ate when there was nothing left to eat. Because famine wasn't a rare disaster back then. It was seasonal, cyclical, predictable, as regular as Lent, except with fewer prayers answered. And unlike modern shortages, medieval famine wasn't just a question of price. You couldn't simply pay more for bread. There was no bread to buy. So people got creative, uncomfortably creative. Let's start with the basics. For the average medieval peasant, diet was already precarious even without famine. Most people relied almost entirely on grains, barley, rye, oats, or whatever the climate allowed. Wheat was the dream grain, but it was mostly reserved for the wealthy, or for church feasts, or for moments when God apparently cared enough to deliver a surplus. For everyone else, daily bread meant dark. Coarse loaves, bread that was heavy, a little sour, and full of whatever was lying around. Ground peas, beans, bits of bran, even dust. A peasant loaf could double as a weapon in a tavern fight. So when famine hit, when crops failed or were destroyed by rain, frost, or war, the first thing to vanish was the bread, and with it went the only thing keeping people full. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is one of the better-known examples. It started, as many bad medieval things did, with the weather. A series of cold, wet summers drowned crops across northern Europe. Fields that usually grew barley turned into soggy ponds, and even livestock began to die from disease and lack of fodder. Chroniclers tell us that oxen collapsed in the fields. Horses starved, and desperate people began eating seed grain, which meant there would be nothing left to plant next year. It's the medieval version of using your rent money to buy dinner. Completely understandable, but catastrophically short-sighted. When the grain ran out, people turned to substitutes. They made bread out of things that technically could be eaten, if you didn't think too hard about it. Tree bark, for example. Not the outer, hard bark. That's indigestible. They'd scrape off the soft inner layer, dry it, grind it, and mix it with whatever flour remained. The result was bark bread, which historians have reconstructed. And yes, it's exactly as depressing as it sounds. It doesn't rise properly, it tastes bitter, and it provides almost no nutrition. But it fills the stomach. And in a famine, that was often the only requirement. Other substitutes included pea husks, ground into flour, acorns, which had to be leached repeatedly in water to remove toxins, dried roots, moss, and sometimes even weeds from the roadside. One chronicler in Sweden wrote that people made bread from leaves, straw, and any green thing they could find. Another in France mentioned that people were baking cakes of earth and grass. It's unclear how literal that was, but in most cases, earth meant clay, mixed into dough to make it stretch further, which means, technically, some people really did eat dirt. Meat, of course, was out of the question for most peasants even in good years. During famine, livestock were often slaughtered early because there was no feed to keep them alive, and that meant a brief glut of meat, followed by nothing. People ate the bones, boiled until they dissolved. They ate animal hides, softened and stewed into something vaguely gelatinous. And when even that ran out, they began eating their horses, dogs, and cats. There are accounts from the famine of 1316 of people boiling dead horses found in the fields. And while some of these stories were exaggerated by horrified clerics, there's enough consistency across regions, England, France, Scandinavia, to suggest it really happened. And then there are the darker reports, stories of people eating the flesh of the dead. Now, before you tense up, no, we're not going to linger on that. This isn't a horror story, but chroniclers did note it, usually with a stunned detachment. One English monk wrote that men devoured their own children, though that's likely a moralizing exaggeration, a medieval way of saying things were very, very bad. Still, there's evidence that desperate people scavenged corpses from gallows or battlefields, not out of cruelty, but out of the same survival instinct that drives all creatures when starvation sets in. It's grim, but it's also, somehow, deeply human. Let's drift back from the worst of it, though. Not every famine ended in such horror. Some communities found ways to survive through cooperation, or sheer stubborn ingenuity. In parts of France and Germany, people dug up old caches of grain that had been hidden underground, sometimes for decades. They scraped mold off the surface and milled what remained. In other cases, villagers pooled what little they had and rationed it carefully, feeding children and the elderly first. Others relied on foraging. Mushrooms, berries, wild herbs, monastic gardens often became lifelines for nearby villagers, and, in a few places, churches opened their granaries, distributing food at the cost of future tithes. Of course, some monasteries just locked their gates, because of course they did. One of the more tragic ironies of medieval famine is that it often struck hardest right after abundance. A few years of good harvests would lead to population, growth, more mouths to feed, less land per person. So when the next bad harvest came, and it always did, the margin for survival had vanished. In England, for example, population nearly doubled between 1100 and 1300. So when the rains came in 1315, the entire system collapsed almost instantly. It's a reminder that medieval Europe wasn't static. It was constantly teetering between fragile prosperity and disaster, a candle burning in a drafty room. Let's pause there for a moment. Imagine you're a peasant in the 14th century. It's early spring, the hungry season, as they called it. Last year's grain is gone. This year's isn't ready. You wake up weak from hunger, knowing there's nothing left but a handful of barley husks and a bit of salt. Maybe some nettles, if you can find them before your neighbor does. You chew slowly, your teeth grinding against grit from the millstone, and you hope for rain. But not too much, because too little means drought, too much means rot, and both mean famine. That was life for millions of people across medieval Europe. A constant negotiation with nature, where one wrong season could undo generations. Now, there's a strange thing about famine. It's not just physical hunger. It becomes cultural. Communities develop rituals, superstitions, even humor around it. Some medieval songs joke about empty bellies and greedy landlords. Others mock saints who refuse to deliver miracles. In parts of Germany, people would bury loaves of bread in mock funerals, pleading with the heavens to resurrect them next year. Humor was a survival tool, the medieval equivalent of memes during lockdown. And famine also changed language. The word starving, for instance, originally meant to die. Only later did it soften to mean very hungry. Because in the Middle Ages, being hungry did mean you might die. It wasn't hyperbole. It was an expectation. By the time Europe entered the 15th century, famine had become less frequent, thanks to slowly improving agriculture and trade. But it never disappeared entirely. Even into the 1600s, bad weather could still bring whole regions to their knees. And yet, through all of it, people adapted. They learned which wild plants could sustain them, how to store food better, how to dry or smoke meat. Each famine was a cruel teacher, but it taught nonetheless. Let's drift to a quieter image. A peasant woman kneeling by a fire, stirring a thin pot of barley water. She drops in a few nettles, maybe a stray turnip. A child beside her yawns, not from sleepiness, but from hunger. Outside, the fields are gray with frost, but she keeps stirring, because that's what people did. They kept stirring, even when the pot was empty. And while the chronicles record the horror, the quiet endurance, the bark bread, the shared handfuls of flour, the faith that next year would be better. That's what truly defined those centuries. By the Renaissance, Attitudes toward cleanliness began to shift. Again, the wealthy began taking pride in frequent washing, though still cautiously. Perfumed waters and scented linens became fashion statements. Doctors still distrusted excessive bathing, but people began to separate smell from health. Yet even by the 16th century, most Europeans still lived surrounded by odors we'd consider catastrophic. The fragrance of history, as it turns out, was mostly manure, smoke, and hope. Let's pause for a moment and breathe safely in the 21st century, because for our ancestors, breathing itself was risky business. Every inhale might bring plague. They thought every breeze could carry sickness, and so they clutched their pomanders, burned their herbs, and prayed for clean air, never realizing that the true killers were invisible, far smaller than smell could detect. Still, there's something oddly comforting about it. A reminder that people have always been trying to make life a little more bearable, even if it meant hanging pockets of civet around their necks. The fragrance of filth. How did people in the Middle Ages deal with bad smells? Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to a world before soap shelves, before scented candles, before anyone thought that lavender might improve the smell of death. A world where people lived surrounded by animals, open sewage, rotting food, and each other, and somehow just got used to it. So, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe light an actually pleasant candle. And let's drift quietly into the Middle Ages, where the concept of fresh air was largely theoretical, and most people smelled like a warm barn on a summer afternoon. To start with, we should clear something up. People in the Middle Ages did not think they smelled bad. That's not denial. That's relativity. When everyone smells like a damp cellar with notes of onion and sheep, that's simply normal. If you time-traveled back to 14th century London, you'd probably gag before you even saw the city gates. But the locals, they'd barely notice. They were nose-blind and also proud of it. The medieval nose was a survival tool. It learned to filter out the background aroma of excrement, unwashed hair, and wet leather, and it was selective. People still noticed smells, just not the same ones we do. To them, the dangerous smells were the ones that felt sickly sweet, heavy, or stagnant, what they called miasma. Bad air didn't just offend the senses. It caused disease, which, to be fair, isn't entirely wrong. They just blamed the wrong culprit. The theory of miasma dominated medieval medicine for centuries. According to it, all sickness came from corrupted air, the fumes of rot, decay, and filth that wafted through cities. If you got sick, it wasn't because of germs. It was because you'd breathed in something foul, usually from a swamp, a corpse, or your neighbor's latrine. And so, medieval people spent centuries fighting smells, not because they wanted to be clean, but because they wanted to be healthy. It was self-preservation, with a floral twist. Now, Cleanliness in the Middle Ages wasn't completely absent. People did wash, just not the way we imagine. A typical person in medieval Europe might bathe once a week, or once a month, depending on the century, the climate, and their access to water. Full-body baths were rare, but face, hands, and feet were often cleaned daily. Especially before meals or prayers, medieval writers even described washing as a form of modesty and respect. Clean hands, clean soul, that sort of thing. So, they weren't oblivious. It's just that bathing was seen as risky. Doctors warned that too much washing could open the pores, allowing bad air, the dreaded miasma, to slip inside and cause illness. And, of course, there was the small matter of where one might bathe. Public bathhouses were common in medieval Europe. Surprisingly enough, cities like Paris, London, and Nuremberg had dozens of them, cheerful, steamy, and extremely social. Imagine a large wooden hall filled with hot tubs, chatter, and the faint smell of wet hemp. People ate, drank, sang, and sometimes conducted business there. Bathhouses were essentially the medieval spa, but with more ale and fewer rules. Naturally, this led to moral panic. By the late Middle Ages, the Church began to frown on bathhouses, claiming they encouraged sinful behavior, which, to be fair, they often did. Bathhouses were prime locations for gossip, flirtation, and prostitution, all marinated in steam. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, bathhouses fell out of favor completely. People feared that heat and water made the body vulnerable to plague-bearing air. So, ironically, in trying to avoid bad smells, they ended up smelling worse. Let's drift into the cities themselves. Picture a medieval street. Narrow, crooked, and paved only in the vaguest sense. Rain turns everything into mud. Chamber pots are emptied out of windows with a quick, "Garde l'eau! Watch out for the water!" which was optimistic at best. Waste from houses flowed directly into open gutters. Animals wandered freely. Pigs rooting through refuse. Chickens scattering straw. Dogs licking everything else. There were occasional attempts at civic order. In 14th century London, citizens were ordered not to dump filth in the street. Instead, they were told to take it outside the city walls. And some did. Most didn't, because carrying waste uphill for an hour wasn't exactly convenient. And medieval convenience usually won. The result was a city that smelled of equal parts dung, dampness, smoke, and humanity, and yet it was home. Inside homes, the situation was only marginally better. Most houses had no chimneys, just holes in the roof to let out smoke, which mostly didn't work. Walls absorbed decades of soot, stew, and sweat. Rushes on the floor were rarely changed, trapping food scraps, fleas, and the occasional dead mouse. When someone did replace their rushes, it was a mini-celebration. A new, fragrant carpet, herbs, and flowers. Yes, herbs. Because here we find one of the Middle Ages' most charming attempts to fight smell. Strewing herbs. People scattered sweet-smelling plants on their floors. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, mint, marjoram. Not for decoration, but as an air freshener. As you walked, you crushed the leaves, releasing pleasant scents, at least for a while. In grander homes, they took it further. Perfumed sachets hung from belts or were tucked into clothing. Rich ladies carried pomanders, ornate metal balls filled with herbs, spices, or musk pressed to their noses when traveling through particularly offensive streets. It was the medieval version of holding your breath on the subway. Doctors even recommended specific herbs to fortify the nose against miasma. Cinnamon, cloves, and sage were favorites, because if bad smells cause disease, then good smells must surely prevent it. You can almost picture the medieval city like a great olfactory battleground. Garlic, dung, and roses, all fighting for dominance. Personal hygiene varied wildly. Monks, for example, were generally cleaner than the average layperson, partly because their rules demanded it, and partly because monasteries had the resources to heat water. Some even had rudimentary plumbing systems with flowing water for washing. But monks also fasted, worked in gardens, and rarely changed clothes. So they smelled of equal parts sanctity and onions. Kings and queens had access to perfumed baths, scented gloves, and fresh linens, but they also lived surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, servants, and animals. Castles were not the fragrant palaces Hollywood likes to show us. Imagine a stone hall with 50 men, 24 dogs, an open fire, and exactly one window. Now imagine someone roasting a goose in that same room. That's the real aroma of medieval royalty. Smoky, greasy, and faintly dog-scented. And then there were the perfumes. Perfume, in the medieval sense, was not delicate. It was overwhelming. A dense mixture of musk, ambergris, and civet. Animal-derived scents that clung to fabric for weeks and announced your presence 5 minutes before you entered the room. Ambergris, famously, came from the digestive systems of sperm whales. Civet came from the glands of a small African mammal that looked like a cat having a bad day. Musk was scraped from deer glands, so even their pleasant smells had a faint undertone of corpse, but people loved it. To medieval nobles, these heavy, exotic scents were luxury incarnate, proof that they could afford to smell unnatural. It was less about masking odor and more about announcing superiority. You didn't just smell rich, you smelled foreign. Speaking of foreign, let's drift over to the Crusaders. When Europeans returned from the Middle East, they brought with them a new appreciation for bathing. Islamic culture placed high importance on cleanliness, and bathhouses were not only common but essential. Crusaders, after years of sweat and sand, were astonished by the scented oils and steam baths of Damascus and Cairo. For a brief time, these habits even influenced European elites, who began building private baths, perfuming water with rose petals and spices. It didn't last. By the late medieval period, paranoia about bad air returned, and many of these practices vanished again. But for a while, Europe genuinely smelled a little better. The most ambitious efforts to control smell, however, came from the cities themselves. In 14th century Paris, officials appointed street inspectors, men whose job it was to monitor waste disposal, clean sewers, and enforce basic hygiene. They had the unenviable task of confronting butchers, tanners, and fishmongers, the three professions most responsible for the city's perfume. Tanners soaked hides in urine and animal fat. Fishmongers dumped their leftovers into the Seine. And butchers, well, they did what butchers do without refrigeration. Parisian. Records from 1180 show royal decrees forbidding butchers from throwing offal and filth into the river. This was repeated almost every decade for the next 300 years, which tells you how well it worked. Of course, the smell of waste wasn't limited to cities. In the countryside, manure was everywhere. On fields, in barns, tracked into homes. It wasn't unpleasant to medieval farmers. It was the smell of life, fertility, and a good harvest. Visitors from towns often complained about the stink of villages, while villagers complained about the stench of towns. So, in a sense, everyone was disgusted by someone else. There's a strange tranquility in that. The quiet persistence of faith amid failure. Because even when monks broke their vows, most didn't abandon belief. They sought forgiveness, and most were given it over and over again. One cooked with fire. Everyone smelled like animals because animals were everywhere. It wasn't bad. It was just normal. Your nose adjusted. Studied herbs, flowers, and deodorant by divine design, of course. Not everyone was content to smell like smoke and goats. There were attempts. Herbs were the medieval deodorant aisle. People tucked rosemary, lavender, and sage into their clothes. They hung sweet-smelling herbs from the rafters, or carried posies of flowers when venturing into town. This wasn't just about vanity. Many believed pleasant smells protected you from disease. According to medieval medical theory, bad smells, miasmas, were dangerous. They carried illness. So, if you surrounded yourself with good smells, you could trick the air into leaving you alone, and so the medieval person's olfactory profile might have included a base of wood smoke, layered with herbal top notes, and a lingering undertone of damp wool. A little rustic, a little tragic, but in context, not bad. Let's drift for a moment to the aristocracy, because, of course, They had their own aromatic dramas. If peasants smelled of earth and labor, nobles smelled of perfume and sin. Perfume in the Middle Ages wasn't quite what we think of today. Alcohol-based scents wouldn't become common until later. Medieval perfume was oil-based, heavy, and prone to turning rancid after a week or two. But it was fashionable. Courtiers dabbed themselves with mixtures of musk, civet, and ambergris, substances which, to put it kindly, came from the less glamorous parts of animals. Musk came from a gland near a deer's genitals. Civet was scraped from the anal glands of civet cats. Ambergris was hardened whale vomit. So yes, the rich did smell different, but not necessarily better. Cleanliness as a moral performance. What's fascinating is how people connected smell to morality. To stink wasn't just unpleasant. It was a sign of sin. The righteous were often described as smelling sweet. Saintly bodies were said to give off a odor of sanctity, a supernatural fragrance that proved their holiness. Meanwhile, sinners, witches, and the unwashed masses were imagined to reek of sulfur and decay. So even the act of bathing could be seen as spiritual hygiene. Monks washed their hands and faces daily, often before prayer. Many monasteries had complex water systems, channels and cisterns for washing linen, hands, and dishes. They took cleanliness is next to godliness, quite literally. Of course, there were exceptions. Some holy men and women avoided bathing altogether as an act of penance. Saint Agnes, for instance, was said to have never washed her body, because cleanliness of the soul mattered more than cleanliness of the flesh. It must have been an aromatic ordeal for those around her. The medieval nose-blind effect. Now, before we judge too harshly, let's remember, everyone's nose in the Middle Ages was calibrated differently. When you live in a world of manure, smoke, and salted fish, your brain stops registering it. What might seem unbearable to us, say, walking into a medieval tavern, was background noise to them. Taverns, by the way, were olfactory adventures. Picture it. Ale sloshed on the floor, unwashed travelers, roasting meat, burning candles, and one poor guy playing the bagpipes in the corner. It must have been like drinking beer inside a compost heap. And yet, everyone loved it. Smells were part of the texture of life. They told you who people were, where they'd been, and what they did for a living. The fishmonger smelled of fish, the baker of yeast and flour, the tanner of horror. You didn't need introductions, you just needed a nose. The smell of home. For the average peasant, the smell of home was the smell of survival. The hearth, always burning. The animals, goats, pigs, chickens, sleeping nearby. their warmth a practical form of heating. The straw bedding changed only when it disintegrated. The stored food, onions, salted pork, maybe a few precious apples. It wasn't luxurious, but it wasn't hellish either. It was earthy, human, and every now and then, when the weather was kind, you'd wash yourself in a cold stream, change into freshly laundered linen, and feel, for a fleeting moment, truly clean. Then you'd step back into your smoky, muddy cottage and undo all that progress instantly. But still, the moment existed. Let's pause here, because we've only just dipped our toes, figuratively, not literally, into medieval hygiene. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into how cities handled sanitation. Spoiler, not well. Why medieval doctors thought bathing could kill you, and how a few creative nobles tried to smell good using methods that were questionable at best. So, take a deep breath, preferably not through your nose, and get comfortable. Because to a medieval mind, the sun wasn't just light, it was order. It was life, rhythm, certainty. If that could fail, even for a few minutes, what else might? And that quiet dread lingered long after the light came back. In our next part, we'll drift into the Renaissance and early modern world, where astronomers like Al-Biruni and Copernicus began to understand eclipses, even as kings and priests continued to misinterpret them. We'll watch as fear turns into curiosity, superstition into science, and the heavens slowly become a place of study rather than panic. But for now, let's rest here, in that brief medieval twilight, where the world held its breath and wondered if the sun would ever return. Perhaps, but a satisfying one. Let's drift over to France again, because French mistresses were an art form, where English affairs were chaotic and improvised. The French perfected the official mistress, the maîtresse en titre. She wasn't just a lover. She was a courtly diplomat, fashion icon, and sometimes unofficial minister of culture. But even art can be replaced. The story of Madame du Barry, the last great mistress of Louis XV, begins like a fairy tale and ends like a public service. Announcement: Jeanne du Barry started life as a servant. She was illegitimate, poor, and inconveniently beautiful. Through a combination of charm, intelligence, and the strategic assistance of a Parisian jeweler, she found herself introduced to the king. Louis was in his 60s. She was 23, and yes, he fell for her instantly. Jeanne became his official mistress, draped in diamonds, painted by court artists, loathed by nearly everyone else. She was kind, generous, and completely unprepared for the politics of Versailles. Meanwhile, in the smaller courts of Europe, royal mistresses followed the same familiar pattern, though with fewer diamonds. In Sweden, King Gustav III's court was so restrained that open mistresses were rare. But in Denmark, King Christian VII's mistress indirectly caused a revolution. Christian was not well. He suffered from mental illness and was largely uninterested in ruling or in his wife, Queen Caroline Matilda. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, his physician and the Queen's lover. Their affair transformed Denmark. Struensee effectively became the ruler, pushing through enlightened reforms while keeping the king sedated and distracted. It went about as well as you'd imagine. When the court discovered the affair, Struensee was executed and Caroline Matilda was exiled. No one mentioned it, but she was technically the mistress of her own husband's doctor. A royal scandal in reverse. After that, even Danish nobles agreed. Perhaps the French system of mistresses was too much administrative work. Of course, being dismissed gracefully was still better than what happened when royal jealousy got involved. Let's drift to Russia, where emotions were large, and forgiveness was optional. Peter the Great was known for two things: modernization and temper. When he discovered his wife Catherine's early affair, he allegedly had her lover executed and his head preserved in a jar. He kept it in her bedroom as a reminder. So, yes, Russian courtship traditions were slightly different. By the time of Catherine the Great, mistresses had become institutionalized. She had several, all young, handsome, and usually rewarded with titles and estates when she grew tired of them. When she dismissed a lover, she did it with exquisite courtesy, and a retirement package large enough to purchase half of Poland. Her final favorite, Platon Zubov, was 39 years younger than she was. When she died, he wept theatrically, collected his fortune, and vanished into obscurity. There's something oddly tender about Catherine's approach. She understood impermanence and compensated accordingly. In England, however, the tone was more sentimental. George IV, for instance, had a habit of falling passionately in love with women he absolutely should not have. His most famous mistress, Maria Fitzherbert, was Catholic, which made their union illegal without Parliament's consent. So, naturally, they married in secret. When the affair eventually cooled, George moved on, married officially, and then resumed pining for Maria in letters he never sent. He kept her portrait in his private rooms until his death. It was perhaps his one enduring act of taste. By the 19th century, the role of royal mistress was fading. Newspapers, photography, and a growing middle-class morality made public affairs harder to disguise. but the echoes lingered. Even Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria, had his share of companions. He was discreet, charming, and too lazy to be scandalous. When one mistress aged out of favor, she was quietly pensioned off, sometimes with a title, sometimes with a very nice house in the countryside. No guillotines, no convents, just a gentle glide into genteel invisibility. And so, across the centuries, royal mistresses followed a remarkably predictable arc. They arrived as fantasies, reigned as necessities, and departed as inconveniences. Some left quietly, some screamed, some went to church. A few, like Madame de Pompadour, managed to turn fading affection into lasting influence. Most did not. They existed in the margins of power, visible only when desired, erased when not, and yet they shaped history in small, invisible ways. Through a whispered word, a gift suggested, a mood softened. For every treaty signed or war declared, there was often a woman just off stage, reminding the king to wear clean socks. In Part 2, we'll drift deeper into their afterlives. The convents, the exiles, the quiet retirements, and the rare cases of revenge. We'll meet the mistress who became a spy, the one who outlived her king by 50 years, and the one who managed to become more famous after her dismissal than during her reign. So close your eyes. Imagine the silk rustling, the candlelight flickering, the faint, fading scent of rose water in a gilded room now empty. Because tomorrow, the court will already have forgotten her name. What happened to monks who broke their vows? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, darker world. The echo of bells over cold stone, the smell of candle wax, parchment, and damp wool. A world filled with chanting, fasting, and long silences, and also, as it turns out, a surprising number of hungover monks. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the modern world fade to a gentle hum. And let's drift together into the cloisters of medieval Europe. Because tonight, we're exploring a question that the Church tried very hard not to advertise. What actually happened to monks who broke their vows? To start, we should remind ourselves what those vows were. When a man joined a monastery, he promised 3 things: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty meant giving up all possessions. Every coin, every scrap of property, even your clothes. Chastity meant never engaging in sexual activity, and, ideally, never even thinking about it. And obedience meant submitting fully to your abbot, your order, and by extension, God. So, basically, no money, no romance, and no freedom. A difficult combination for any century. It's no wonder some monks struggled. Let's start with poverty. because that one was broken first and most often. Despite their vows, medieval monasteries were some of the wealthiest institutions in Europe. They owned land, mills, vineyards, fisheries, and even villages. They collected rents, produced wine, and lent money, sometimes at interest, which was technically forbidden, but done anyway. So while individual monks weren't supposed to own anything, they lived surrounded by the collective wealth of their order. A monk might technically be poor, but his monastery might have its own brewery, a fish pond, and enough silverware to outfit a small castle. And naturally, temptation followed. There are countless records of monks hoarding personal items. A hidden coin, a private knife, a few extra books under the bed. In one 14th century English visitation report, an abbot complained that his brothers were secretly wearing silk under their habits. "Fine linen," he wrote, "unbefitting their station." Translation: they were basically medieval monks wearing designer underwear. Others accumulated actual property. In some cases, wealthy families donated land to monasteries, but allowed their relative, now a monk, to live comfortably off the proceeds. Everyone pretended it wasn't his personal income. Just a friendly arrangement with God. When caught, the punishment for breaking poverty varied. If it was small, say, keeping a little pocket change, the monk might be ordered to confess publicly and give it up. If it was larger or repeated, the consequences could be more serious. Fasting, solitary confinement, or even expulsion. And expulsion was brutal. Imagine being thrown out of the only life you'd known, forbidden to wear your habit, branded as an oath-breaker, and turned loose into a world that didn't particularly want a disgraced monk hanging around. Some ended up wandering, begging, or joining the army. A very different kind of brotherhood. But poverty wasn't the vow most often broken. That honor belongs, rather predictably, to chastity. Now, celibacy was never simple in the medieval world. The Church told its monks to view women as spiritual sisters, to resist temptation through prayer and penance, but monasteries were often located right next to villages, and villages contained people. And people tend to be distracting. There's an almost comic abundance of records documenting monks who couldn't resist temptation, from small indiscretions to full-blown affairs. Take the case of Brother Thomas of Ely in the 13th century. He was caught visiting a nearby nun's convent after dark, repeatedly. When questioned, he claimed it was for spiritual conversation. The abbot didn't buy it. Thomas was confined to his cell for a year, given only bread and water on Fridays, and forbidden to speak to any women ever again. Another report from York mentions a monk who fathered not one, but 2 children with the same local woman. He was ordered to perform a public act of penance, walking barefoot through the streets, flogged by his fellow brothers while reciting the Psalms. It was considered both humiliating and purifying, a medieval spiritual reset. And yet, the same report notes that after a few years, he quietly resumed his relationship. Apparently, penance doesn't always work. Sometimes, affairs happened within the church itself. Monks and nuns were supposed to live separately, but that didn't always stop them. Letters survive from abbots, scolding abbesses for allowing over-familiarity between the houses. One particularly scandalous case in France involved an entire double monastery. Men and women living on the same grounds, where, as one bishop complained, the sisters go about in fine attire, the brothers in their company, and all seem more inclined to dancing than devotion. He closed the monastery, which was probably wise. Of course, not all breaches of chastity involved romance. There were darker stories, abuses of power, coercion, even violence. But monasteries were closed systems, and such things were often handled quietly, internally, or not at all. The church preferred repentance to scandal. Better to discipline a sinner than admit the sin publicly, and so many punishments were private. A transfer to another house, a lifetime of silence, or being shut in a small cell to meditate on one's failings until further notice. Some monks were never released. Still, not every lapse was treated with equal severity. A monk who confessed voluntarily, say, overcome with guilt after years of pious service, might be forgiven with mild penance. A monk caught red-handed or red-faced was more likely to face harsh discipline. One abbot in 15th century Germany even introduced a rule book for punishments. One night of sin, a week of fasting, a prolonged affair, 3 months penance and public confession, a child born of the union, permanent expulsion. It's grimly bureaucratic, sin by the numbers. Then there was the vow of obedience, the one that caused the most political trouble. Because monasteries weren't just spiritual centers. They were workplaces, communities, and sometimes miniature kingdoms, and abbots could be tyrants. Disobedience might mean anything from leaving the monastery without permission, to refusing an order, to open rebellion, and yes, monks rebelled. In 1320, a group of English Benedictines barricaded themselves in their dormitory to protest. Poor food and overwork, they refused to come out for prayers until their demands were met. Trente-six, abbot called in soldiers. It ended poorly. Another revolt took place at Abingdon Abbey, where the monks accused their abbot of hoarding money and living too luxuriously. He, in turn, accused them of gluttony and insubordination. After weeks of standoff, the bishop had to intervene, ordering the abbot to tone down his spending, and the monks to stop throwing bread at him during meals. The moral? Even in God's house, dinner arguments happen. When obedience was broken by simply leaving, the monk became what was known as a fugitive brother, a sort of medieval runaway. Some left because they hated the discipline. Others left for love, or for adventure. A few became mercenaries or pirates, their shaved tonsures a lingering joke among their new comrades. Monasteries took runaway monks seriously, though they sent letters to other houses warning them not to harbor apostates, and sometimes they hired men to bring them back, forcibly. One account from France describes a monk who escaped, was captured, and returned in chains. He was flogged, imprisoned, and eventually reinstated after years of penance. Because nothing says forgiveness like 3 years in solitary confinement. But occasionally, monks found creative loopholes. Some transferred to looser orders, swapping Benedictine discipline for more relaxed Franciscan poverty, or vice versa. Others petitioned the Pope himself for release from vows. And the Pope, for a price, could be remarkably understanding. A few monks even became priests or bishops later in life, after conveniently forgetting about their early misbehavior. It was, after all, an age when holiness was negotiable. Not all vow-breakers met grim ends, though some lived on quite comfortably outside the system. Take John Tiptoft, an English monk who left his abbey in the 1400s to become a royal clerk. Technically, he was an apostate, but he went on to serve under 3 kings, collect a fortune, and die peacefully in his bed. So, as with most things in medieval Europe, punishment depended less on the sin, and more on who you were. Now, beyond the formal rules, there's something quietly human in all this. These men weren't monsters or fools. They were just people trying to live impossible ideals, trapped between devotion and desire, silence and longing, obedience and resentment. The monasteries promised peace, but for many, that peace never came, just long hours, cold mornings, and the distant memory of freedom. Breaking a vow wasn't just sin. It was the ultimate act of exhaustion. The soul simply giving up. Let's pause there for a moment. Imagine the sound of the monastery at night, the silence of the cloister, the flicker of a candle by the abbot's door. Somewhere, a monk kneels in confession, whispering about stolen coins or stolen kisses. Another lies awake, wondering if God still listens, and tomorrow they'll all rise before dawn and chant as though nothing happened. In a world where sin was inevitable, repentance was its own form of survival.